and push the record button. Thank you. So welcome. I want to thank the people that are making this possible. As I mentioned, Randy Block, our director. I saw one of our board members there already, Mary Jo from the Birmingham congregation. In fact, our president, she's doing an amazing job. Rob for being here, and Sharon for handling some of the behind the scene tech stuff. So she'll be continuing to let people in. If you have any concerns, particularly accessibility issues, if you directly message her or just put those concerns in the chat, then Sharon can follow up with you. And she and I will be watching the chat a bit, but mostly her. So if you have questions and you don't want to wait until the end, you can throw them in the chat. And then when we get to that point, I can read those questions out as well. So welcome for being here. Thank you. Again, I said it's so great to see so many people, familiar faces across the years and from different congregations, and also so many new names and faces. And I look forward to getting to know more about you as we continue to work together with MUUSJN. We're doing some exciting things. As most of you probably know, MUUSJN is a statewide network, the Michigan Unitarian Universalist Social Justice Network. If you want to learn more about us, we have a website that's in pretty good shape right now, but is starting to get a little bit more spiffy and will be in the next few months. But our website is uujustice.org, and you can learn more about what we're all doing. I typically work on issues related to environmental and racial justice. And Sharon, who's doing our behind the scene work there, works on issues related to LGBTQ justice. We have Nomi, who works on women and reproductive justice, and also really is a leader behind a lot of the Get Out of the Vote work that we're doing this year. Sharon has taken some leadership in that in the past. Sharon has a newsletter that she sends out, Welcome In. So if you want to find out more about that, you can find her email on our website. And there's also a great recording if you missed our webinar that we did last month on calling Decolonizing the Mind. We had 2 Native American speakers come in and talk about how the Native American community was impacted when settlers first came here and colonized this space up until today, and things that they're still struggling with. And we're going to continue that series of Decolonize the Mind with a web event at the end of March, and then probably again in March, April, May. MUUSJN is excited that we just got a grant from the Michigan Alliance for Justice and Climate, which is going to allow us to do some environmental justice-based web events over the next 5 months too. So look for that publicity to come out. We're going to be starting in March, middle of March, with one on water justice, both related to safe and affordable water, as well as Line 5 and what's going on right now with Line 5 in the Mackinac Straits. So thank you for being here. Thank each and every one of you for being here. I want to start with a brief reading and light our chalice. And so, where did I put it? Ah, right there. Our prophets died for the freedom of faith. We are here in their spirit. We are here to practice and sustain our living tradition, claiming for justice the heat and power of fire. In our free faith, we are here, seeking freedom from despair, the freedom to be loved as ourselves, and the freedom to grow beyond imagination. We are here, gathered in the name of all that we find holy. Let us give thanks for the gift of gathering here. I have my beautiful moon chalice that I will give some light to. And then I'm going to find a safe place to put this during our call tonight, but it will be out of your vision, but it will continue to shine a light on our time together. I would also like to, before I turn it over to Rob, share a land acknowledgement statement that I wrote. We are on stolen, occupied land. And for me personally, where I'm sitting right now is in what's colonists named Livonia. The land originally was inhabited by people from the Fox, Peoria, Anishinaabe, Potawatomi, and Mississauga tribes. Many of them were murdered by colonists, who also raped their women while they stole their children, land, and belongings. However, many of their descendants of these tribes are still here, and many are still carrying on with Native traditions, including caring for the land and water. I give reverence to the Indigenous ancestors who nurtured this land and the life that once inhabited the sacred ground and the waters here. I give gratitude to those members of tribal communities today who continue to tell the stories and honor the land and waters in Michigan and around the world. I see a future as the past I imagine, with an abundance of healthy land and growing things, animals, fish, waterways, and air. If we listen to the voices of the ancestors and those closest to these lands now, we can learn how to dwell here in a respectful and lasting way. Relationship with the earth is something the colonists didn't seem to honor or realize was necessary for the future of their descendants. It is past time to return the stolen land to the Indigenous descendants who still understand and practice those relationships. I am committed to love, truth, and reconciliation. I will act on these values. I am acting on these values by reading, learning, building relationships, listening, supporting and following the lead of Indigenous-led organizations and grassroots movements. Especially when I am invited, I will attend cultural events such as powwows and food and craft sharing, learn about land back and land tax opportunities, and Line 5 in Lake Michigan, the DTE Fermi 2 nuclear plant off the Erie River, the health of local rivers and areas where native plants and other things thrive. The work with the murdered and missing Indigenous women, and racism in and around the United States, where we still have very harmful names, racist names for school mascots. I invite you to join me. Let me know if you want info on how to get involved with these events, issues. Thank you. And so we're all here tonight to learn more about Article 2, this very, very important piece of our base of our religion. And so I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Rob Spirko, who is a member of the Article 2 Commission from the time it was formed. And he'll tell you a little bit about himself and the work that he and his group have been working on. Thank you, Rob.
Thank you, Jenny. Yeah, I'm coming to you all from East Tennessee, the land of the Cherokee and Muskogee Creek nations. I'm also particularly delighted to be here with the Michigan Social Justice Network. We're trying to get a Tennessee Social Justice Network up and running for the UUs here, and Lord knows we need it down here. If you followed any of the news out of Tennessee, you know, it's yeah, we've got quite a lot going on here. So it's nice to see a vigorous and engaged social justice network that I can crib notes from. So, you know, like I said, I'm pleased to be here. I am from East Tennessee. I work at the University of Tennessee, go Vols, and live in Maryville, which is just south. I started my UU journey at Tennessee Valley UU Church in Knoxville, and was a member there until 2009. And we started up a congregation in my town, about 20 miles south then. And so we've been going for about 15 years here. And so, you know, that's just a little bit about my background there. You know, I've been a congregational board secretary, board president, worship leader, and religious educator. And I've done some work with the Southern Region staff, helping organize leadership trainings and facilitating board workshops and things like that. But yeah, and then I got named to the Article 2 Study Commission, which is what I'm here to tell you about tonight and to answer questions. And so let me share. I hope you all are seeing this. And you know, people come to this with a variety of levels of knowledge and information about it. So I apologize if some of this is old news for some of you. I'm almost certain it's new news for other people. Um, and so I do want to kind of run through a little bit of the background. I think that may answer some questions that people might have. And it may provoke other questions. That's kind of what I'm hoping, is that, you know, we get to make sure we all have a shared understanding of where we're at with this, and it might spur you to think about, you know, other things to ask about. But this is a picture of us gathered in Washington, D.C., where we were working on it together a bit. The commission itself is me, my co-chair, Reverend Cheryl M. Walker, Dr. Paula Cole Jones is on the commission as well as Satya Mamdani and Maya Waller. We are the commission members. Reverend Gianni Foliano is our very adept staff support. And our board liaisons are currently Kathy Burek. Well, formerly, she has rotated off the board, but Reverend Meg Riley. In the past, Greg Carroll Boyd was our also board liaison with us, and Becky Brooks started the journey with us, but had to step back from it. So to give you a sense of where this comes from, because some people have had questions about that, the charge to our commission was created by the UUA board, which the bylaws require a review of Article 2 every 15 years. Right. It's intended that this be reviewed and revised and changed as circumstances change, as needs change. And then in 2017 at the General Assembly there, several things kind of came to a head. Right. The eighth principle movement was on people's minds. Some people had raised questions about extending the first principle to all beings instead of just all people. You know, people had raised questions about why Buddhism and Islam had not been included in the sources, just a number of things like that. And so the board decided at that point to just sort of open it up, right, to do a general view of Article 2, you know, because it seemed like there was a lot of things fermenting, things bubbling in terms of what people wanted to you know, change with it. So they held workshops at the GAs in 2018 and 2019 to help them frame the charge. Alandria Williams and Reverend Mr. Barb Grieve, who were the co-moderators at the time, worked with the board to develop that charge. And the whole thing is available on the website. I'll drop the link in the chat here in a little while. But I did want to focus on a couple of paragraphs particularly, because I think it frames up, you know, kind of pretty well what we were, you know, asked to do. We charge this commission to root its work in love as a principal guide in its work, attending particularly to the ways that we and our root traditions have understood and articulated love and how we have acted out of love. The commission is charged with reviewing all sections of Article 2 and is free to revise, replace, or restructure them as needed to meet the objectives stated above. There is nothing sacred about the number of principles or sources, nor their specific wordings, nor in the way that Article 2 is laid out. We encourage creativity. And then I wanted to add this. This was a comment from Reverend Bill Sinkford at a conversation we had between him and Susan Frederick Gray and Meredith Garman, talking about covenant. And that's available, again, as one of the resources from the site. But something he said sort of stuck with me. He said, we need to have a kind of accountability to inspect the way our covenant has functioned and ask how we need it to function for us if we're going to be the people, the religious people that we want to be, that we are called to be, and we promise ourselves that we'll become. And, you know, I mean, that's kind of, you know, something I took to heart and we talked about a lot on the commission is, you know, what can we do with Article 2 that would help us, you know, in the journey to be who we are called to become, who we can be in the world. So, our work started after General Assembly 2020. We worked just to get to know each other and build trust together, which was important, I think, and to build a shared understanding of the scope of the charge and the history of Article 2, what its functions were. I'm happy to elaborate on some of that if people have questions. We designed a feedback process that included surveys and interviews and these other things, resources, etc. Um, you know, I can make the slides available to people afterwards if you all want them. But yeah, we did a lot of that pre-work. At General Assembly 2021, we led a workshop on values and articulating our shared UU values. At General Assembly 2022, we had hour-long segments in each general session. So there were 3 hour-long segments in which we talked about Article 2 and ran draft language by the delegates and surveyed them about their responses. We put articles in the UU World. We did other surveys and engagements and things from 2021 into 2022. We got together and reviewed all that. We drafted a proposal, and then we sent out drafts. Right, and we had Zoom sessions for feedback back in late 2022. There were 21 different sessions getting feedback on different elements of it. So we took all that information, met and revised it again, presented to the Board of Trustees in January of 2023. There was then an online process for people to offer amendments once the proposal was out. I've got to credit Charles Dumond for doing a lot of the work in terms of figuring out the structures of how to make that possible and, accessible to people, which was, quite a challenge, I think. And so then at General Assembly 2023, there was a vote to move the proposed Article 2 forward to have a final vote next year. Right, and that vote passed 86 to 14%, and it also passed several amendments. Several of those proposed amendments got enough support, to be included. Right, because changing Article 2 is a 2-step process. Basically, there's this first vote, which had happened and had to get a majority, and then the second vote has to get a supermajority. So we met and then incorporated the amendments. The bylaws sort of specified how we would do that. We took time then to do a plain language review to check it for readability and understanding, and a legal review. The UUA has anything passed the General Assembly also goes to a legal review with the General Counsel. So we incorporated that and then published the final version in October 2023. And it's available again on the website. But there was an online amendment process again because it was still amendable. It required 15 congregations to support the amendments this time. The bar is going to be a little higher. They've got to have a 3/4 majority. We've got to be real sure we want to make amendments at this point. But then at General Assembly 2024, we'll vote whether or not to adopt this, new revised version of the proposal, and it's got to get a 2/3 majority vote this time to pass. Right. So, when we started this process, honestly, I was a little impatient. I was like, let's get to the vote, let's do this. But I think building in time for deliberation, time for information to get out, I've increasingly seen how important that is. And that changes of this scale really do need, the time that this process has allowed. Something that Cheryl and I especially like to do, but we as the commission have, decided, we like to read the article proposal out loud, just to make sure everybody has heard it. You've taken the time to sort of sit with it, when we released the draft, we said read it through 3 times. The first time just to, encounter it, and then sit with your feelings and what it makes you feel, and then move to what it makes you think about, what suggestions you might have, all that sort of stuff. Um, and so, I mean, we're in a different phase now, but I always tell my students, I teach writing at UT, to read their papers out loud, to read their writing out loud. You hear it in a different way sometimes than you see it on the page. Um, and especially because this incorporates the amendments, and people might not be as familiar with this as they were, with the version that came into the General Assembly. Um, I thought it would be useful to go through it together, so that again we're all kind of on the same page with what it is. Um, Purposes. The Unitarian Universalist Association shall devote its resources to and exercise its organizational powers for religious, educational, and humanitarian purposes. Its primary purposes are to assist congregations in their vital ministries, to support and train leaders, both lay and professional, to foster lifelong faith formation and spiritual development, to heal historic injustices, to support and encourage the creation of new Unitarian Universalist communities, and to advance our Unitarian Universalist values in the world. The Unitarian Universalist Association will actively engage its members in the transformation of the world through liberating love. As Unitarian Universalists, we covenant congregation to congregation and through our association to support and assist one another in our ministries. We draw from our heritages of freedom and reason, hope and courage, building on the foundation of love. Love is the power that holds us together and is at the center of our shared values. We are accountable to one another for doing the work of living our shared values through the spiritual discipline of love. Inseparable from one another, these shared values are, and here's a picture of the values flower, which has a chalice in the center with the word love over the flame, and then around it are the circle or wheel of values. Each is given a different color in this diagram. Interdependence, which is orange, equity is red, transformation is purple, pluralism is blue, generosity is green, and justice is yellow. Justice. We work to be diverse, multicultural, beloved communities where all people thrive. We covenant to dismantle racism and all forms of systemic oppression. We support the use of inclusive democratic processes to make decisions within our congregations, our association, and society at large. Generosity. We cultivate a spirit of gratitude and hope. We covenant to freely and compassionately share our faith, presence, and resources. Our generosity connects us one to another in relationships of interdependence and mutuality. Transformation. We adapt to the changing world. We covenant to collectively transform and grow spiritually and ethically. Openness to change is fundamental to our Unitarian Universalist heritages, never complete and never perfect. Pluralism. We celebrate that we are all sacred beings, diverse in culture, experience, and theology. We covenant to learn from one another in our free and responsible search for truth and meaning. We embrace our differences and commonalities with love, curiosity, and respect. Equity. We declare that every person has the right to flourish with inherent dignity and worthiness. We covenant to use our time, wisdom, attention, and money to build and sustain fully accessible and inclusive communities. Interdependence. We honor the sacred interdependent web of all existence. With reverence for the great web of life and with humility, we acknowledge our place in it. We covenant to protect Earth and all beings from exploitation. We will create and nurture sustainable relationships of care and respect. We will work to repair harm and damaged relationships. Inspirations. Direct experiences of
Rob,
transcending mystery. Yeah.
I just want to
Mhm.
interject for one moment.
Yeah.
And just first of all, remind people that we are going to send the slides, and we'll also send some really good links, direct links to things from the UUA website where you can find this all written out and you can find other resources as well. But I also just wanted to say, after hearing those values, I'd like us to just pause for a minute. And if everybody could just think about how they feel in their body after hearing those statements, and think about, and you may have been doing this when you were listening to them, or you may have done this as you've read through them before this session, but I think it's a good time to say, do those values represent who I am and how I want to be in this world? So just take a minute and think about that.
Mhm.
Okay, thanks, Rob.
Oh, you're welcome. And thanks for making me pause. Inspirations. Direct experiences of transcending mystery and wonder are primary sources of Unitarian Universalist inspiration. These experiences open our hearts, renew our spirits, and transform our lives. We draw upon and are inspired by sacred, secular, and scientific understandings that help us make meaning and live into our values. These sources ground us and sustain us in ordinary, difficult, and joyous times. We respect the histories, contexts, and cultures in which these sources were created and are currently practiced. Grateful for the experiences that move us, aware of the religious ancestries we inherit, and enlivened by the diversity which enriches our faith, we are called to ever deepen and expand our wisdom. Inclusion. Systems of power, privilege, and oppression have traditionally created barriers for persons and groups with particular identities, ages, abilities, and histories. We pledge to replace such barriers with ever-widening circles of solidarity and mutual respect. We strive to be an association of congregations that truly welcome all persons who share our values. We commit to being an association of congregations that empowers and enhances everyone's participation, especially those with historically marginalized identities. Freedom of belief. Congregational freedom and the individual's right of conscience are central to our Unitarian Universalist heritage. Congregations may establish statements of purpose, covenants, and bonds of union so long as they do not require that our members adhere to a particular creed. All right, so that is the Article 2 proposal. Now, like I mentioned earlier, there are some amendments that will be considered at GA 2024, and I wanted to share those with you too, just so you had access to that and can weigh those, have plenty of time to weigh those before the General Assembly. Again, there was an online process to propose them. 15 congregations had to sign up to support, these amendments to ensure that they had a broad base of support. And could reasonably get to, that 3/4 majority that will be needed to pass them. So there are two amendments to the equity value. You see the original language there at the top. The first amendment would change that first sentence to, we declare that every person is inherently worthy and has the right to flourish with dignity, love, and compassion. And there was a second amendment, which would add at the end a new sentence that says, equity calls us to listen, understand, respect, and respond to one another. There was an amendment to add reason as a value. Reason. We search for truth and meaning, informed by reason, evidence, and the results of science, motivated by wonder, curiosity, and compassion. We covenant to listen to and respect the views of others and to remain open to new ideas. And then there was another amendment to add peace as a value. Peace. We dedicate ourselves to peaceful conflict resolution at all levels. We covenant to promote a peaceful world community with liberty and human rights for all. Whenever and wherever possible, we will support nonviolent means to achieve peace. All right. And so those are the amendments. That's what the suggestions, have been now to, uh, you know, make those changes. And so, yeah, like I said, I hope that informs you somewhat. Again, if that spurs new questions, that's great. But I know, Jenny, you had curated some questions that had been sent in ahead of time. And I think, that maybe a lot of people might share. So yeah, let's, kind of kick into that and, you know,
Yeah, thank you.
liven this up a little. Yeah.
Thank you. I also want to address what's going on in the chat because I've been trying to monitor that as close as I can, and I've written down a bunch of the questions that were there. And that Reverend Kerr raised in the chat, I'm not seeing all the previous chats. Have they been deleted? And I responded to that. I don't think anything's been deleted because I've been writing things down, but clear transparency. Then I wrote down something someone asked, and now I don't see it in the chat. And so I want people to know that I'm not deleting things. And if somebody else has the power to delete things and you are, that's not helpful in this process, how we're moving today. Because the whole point of doing this is every Unitarian Universalist probably has different feelings about whether they support Article 2 and the amendments as they're learning more. Certainly our consultants and our board members have different opinions, and MUUSJN doesn't have a stance on this. And I have personal feelings, but I'm not bringing them into this meeting tonight. The whole purpose of MUUSJN carrying this work forward is that we really want our congregations to have full information, and we want you to be able to have those dialogues with people you live with and people in your congregation so that you all can decide what is very valid to you. So I do have some questions, but just for the sake of that question from Reverend Keir, I'm going to ask the first question that I wrote down that now I don't see in the chat anymore. And that question was, our congregation voted last year 70% in favor of keeping the principles rather than accepting the amendments to Article 2? And will that be a problem with the UUA? And when you answer that question, Rob, could you, one of the questions that I got from folks was about the principles in general. Somebody said the principles are the perfect elevator speech. There's a lot of people who don't want the principles to go away. And there's also, of course, the eighth principle that people are talking about and are confused along with this. So if you can kind of touch base on many of those things, that will be great.
Yeah, yeah.
And Mark does see the question I just read in the chat. So I don't know, something weird is going on in the chat where everybody's not seeing everything apparently. I don't know. But thanks for seeing that, Mark.
Right. Yeah. So what was the first question again, Jenny? The first part of that?
Their congregation voted 70% in favor to keep the principles.
Right.
How will and not Article 2, how will that be a problem with the UUA?
Really that's a question for the UUA. I don't know how it would be, in a sense, but honestly, that's a question for the board. I would think, you know what I mean? Like, in other words, because Article 3 governs membership, let me introduce you to the fact there's an Article 3, right, that actually defines the congregational, polity of the UUA. Um, and I can talk more about that maybe here in a second. Um, you know, this kind of thing is not really a factor in that Article 3, So, yeah, I don't imagine that it would create problems with the UUA. I mean, but, I'm not privy to what the board thinks on that matter. So, um, but, you know, but again, I think the power of it to be a problem for the UUA is kind of limited. And I can maybe explain that in a minute. In terms of that other question about the principal being a great elevator speech, um, I mean, y'all must have taller buildings or slower elevators in Michigan than we do in Tennessee. Um, my office is on the 12th floor of my building, and I'm not sure I could get through the first 3 principals by the time we got up there. But but to take the point seriously there, um, I mean, elevator speeches are an interesting thing, right? I mean, the elevator speech I give, for instance, when I'm working table at Pride, is different than the speech that I would give to a colleague of mine at the university, in the elevator, like you've got 30 seconds or so of somebody's attention. And, you sort of got to lead with the essence of it. Um, you know, one of the things I've been saying is that, we're a religion that puts love at the center, and that believes that we don't have to think alike to love alike. And if I have a little more time, then I can say that love calls us to act with justice and promote equity, to change and grow and transform ourselves, to be generous, to respect diversity and pluralism, and I kind of can go through some of that. Um, but I mean, personally, I kind of think it scales very well, right? In the sense that you can start with love, you can expand it to love and the other values, and you could expand it even further from that, if you get people's attention. Um, you know, uh,
Rob, take a little bit more time because another some question was what's the definition of love in this situation?
yeah, boy, you know, I teach poetry, and if we could come up with a definition of love, we might have settled out with Shakespeare 400 years ago, maybe, I guess. The lawyers wanted a definition of love when they did the legal review, and we told them no, no, like um, the kind of love we're talking about here. I mean, it's sort of encapsulated there in the beginning part and in the values. It's a liberating love. It is, the kind of love that seeks justice, and it does promote equity, and it is generous, and it has the other characteristics of the values, right? That's the sort of love we're talking about. Is the light that refracts through those as lenses, if you want to think of it with a different metaphor. Um, you know that love is really complicated, and that we sort of mean a lot of the meanings of love, right? People are familiar with, the kind of 3 Greek eros, philia, and agape, for instance, right? Those different aspects, but there were even other types of love that the Greeks talked about, right? Like, and the word's escaping me, but when I heard it, I immediately thought it's like a technical love, almost a detailed love, right? It made me think of like our church treasurer, right, whose love for that congregation, our congregation shows up, in taking care of the books very carefully and stewarding our resources. He's also one of the people that shows up, to help set up for every service beforehand, right? And just taking care of making sure all the boxes are moved and all this stuff. He's a firefighter, a retired firefighter. This is not a sentimental man, right? He doesn't express emotions in those ways, but his love is his care for the congregation in these real technical supportive ways, right? That kind of love is important. just as much as just general love for humanity and that sort of stuff. The love of people who do the work, right? So anyway, I mean, that may not be a super satisfactory answer in that way, but I mean, my short version of that is, I mean, the kind of love we're talking about is the kind of love that, it's refracted, it shows up in those values, and it seeks to make us all free.
Okay, the answer is not, everybody's not fully satisfied with that. Somebody mentions if you can't define love, don't make it the central part of our values. But also Reverend Diablo mentions and raises agape love, as you did. And I heard that, read that in some of the literature too. I also just read a great book by Bell Hooks about love. And I really felt a similarity between what we're talking about here with Unitarian Universalism and the way that she was defining love in that book.
Right. Yeah.
But love is the central tenet of other religions, including Christianity and Judaism. Doesn't this make us just like everybody else? In effect, saying me too, instead of emphasizing how we are different and better.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question, interesting point. And I think that, it is. I mean, it provides us a bridge to do interfaith work, right? You know, um, you know, but we shouldn't shy away from that fact about ourselves just because we also share it with other religions, I think. Um, you know, um, but also, and this is part of what the values are there to help clarify, right? And especially, for me, one of the big things that leaps out is pluralism, which, is really sort of very distinctive to us as opposed to a lot of other religions. Um, that's for me a real important value, right? And we had big discussions about it, and how to articulate it in there, because it is one of the most distinctive things about us, right? That that we're a church. You can come in and you're sitting next to an atheist and a pagan, right? And you're cool with that, right? And if you're not cool with that, you're not going to have a great time at a UU church, right? That is something that makes us distinctive from a lot of other places, right? And so, so I get the criticism of that, but at the same time, we are distinctive in the way we realize love, I think. And so, again, the values give more of that flavor, right?
Rob,
And in the, yeah.
Let me take you back to the principles, because so many people are concerned about losing the principles.
Right.
Are we losing the principles? Do people have to take their 7 principles down and cover it up in their hymnal?
No, I mean, I don't see that necessarily happening, right? Like, the principles are good, they're useful, they're helpful, they're, great, ethical stances to have, right? Um, you know, um, they didn't work great as a covenant, I'll be honest, right? Article 2 is the covenant between congregations. And, one of the challenges is, we know a lot better how to write a covenant than we did 40 years ago when the current Article 2 was passed. Um, Covenants tend to ask us to do things, right? The only verbs in the current Article 2 are affirm and promote, which are pretty weak verbs and pretty vague, honestly. Um, you know, um, and the other thing I'll point out just real quick is the Article 2 is a covenant between congregations. I mean, I do, you know, like you mentioned earlier, Jenny, about like sort of sitting with it and thinking about if these are your values, right? And that's true. At the same time, they need to be values that the congregation would agree to uphold, right? Can the congregation agree about being generous and about, promoting equity and, respecting pluralism and, transforming and growing, right? Because, that's the primary level on which Article 2 works, right? One of the things we found, and, I kind of did an analysis of this for the commission, there are a lot of different ways we use Article 2 now, right? We use it as a statement of belief sometimes. People use it, right? People taking it individually as a statement. You know, we put it up on their refrigerators, we put it in our hymnal and all this stuff. You know, there are not a lot of organizations that do that with their bylaws, honestly, right? They don't, you know, put them up on the walls like we do. But because Article 2 is this thing that all our congregations agree to, right? It has sort of come to stand in, you know, for a lot of these other functions, right? But we use it rhetorically and, you know, like political rallies and school board meetings and things like that. We use it, you know, to structure our RE programs, right? We use it, you know, in all these different ways that, you know, maybe it wasn't originally intended to be used, right? Honestly. And so we sort of had to take that into account as we were doing the revision. But all that to say, getting back to the principles, you know, yes, absolutely, congregation can keep them up. You know, the 7 or the 8, right? You know, absolutely, you can keep the sources. You know, to base your RE curriculums on. You know, that they're still important, and you will, you know, like we said, we sort of, well, one metaphor I like to use, we sort of planted the principles and watched what they grew into with this. You can still see, you know, the language of the principles in the current proposal, right? So in that way, they haven't gone away. And in a sense, they can remain the principles. Like if we had radically revised the principles themselves and sort of issued new principles or, you know, whatever, you know, then in a way we would be repealing the old principles, right? We would be replacing them with something. And doing it this way, we've still got the principles as the principles, and we can sort of still access those. They just won't be in Article 2.
Yeah,
So
thank you. And I wanted to add that I've heard from the 8th Principle team and Paula Cole Jones, who's one of the leaders of that work, that she also and they also are continuing the 8th Principle work and encouraging congregations to still add the 8th Principle. And so it certainly would be silly to have an 8th Principle and not the other 7. There's some questions that are coming up, and there's some correlation on that here too with some of our notes. I want to go back to covenant for a minute, because that's another thing that I'm hearing both in the chat and I've heard other concerns and questions. Can you say more about covenant? I'm going to give you kind of three pieces of some different questions.
right.
Can you say more about covenant? Who determines if you are in or out of covenant? And then also, Donna understands that governing boards don't contain covenants because they are relational in nature. Why are there so many covenants? And you were kind of just hitting on that a little bit, but could you touch on those pieces?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I mean, to that point about, you know, the governing documents don't contain covenants. I mean, ours do, ours does, right? Like literally the current Article 2 says we covenant to affirm and promote these principles. And, you know, it is an agreement between congregations. It is a covenant, right? You know, and then that form of governance goes back, right, to the, you know, Cambridge platform in the 1600s, right? You know, it's got a long history that we grow out of there. Um, so, um, so yeah, you know, that we continued. I mean, that's one of the things we identified earlier in our work, right? Is the Article 2 represents a covenant between congregations. And so what do we know about covenants, right? And you know, what they're useful for and how they work and all that. Yeah, you know, I mentioned, I think we're better at them now. We have used them a lot more, right? And I'm, you know, personally really thankful that, you know, my congregation has one, the board has one, right? They really have proved a lot of, honestly, practical benefit in terms of resolving conflict and stuff like that, right? But so yeah, so so in terms of you know, governing documents and covenants, I mean, you know, we are building on what we have on that front, right? You know, and that
And
deeper question, like who determines being in and out of covenant, you know, that's, you know, the general answer is, I mean, the, you know, the people who covenant together, right? I mean, it is an association of equals in that sense, right? And that, what happens when, somebody thinks that somebody's broken covenant is you have a conversation about it, right? You work to repair a relationship that has been damaged in some way, for instance. Um, so yeah, like it's in terms of who determines that, it's each other in my congregation, right? We would talk with each other. Maybe you want to get a third person in to sort of a mediator if it needs that or something, right? But that would, there's not an automatic mediator or something like that. It's not determined by an authority. Determined by each other. And we say in the opening part, what's um, the language there is specifically, um, we covenant congregation to congregation and through our association, right? We are accountable to one another for doing the work of living our shared values, right? So that's who we're accountable to, is other congregations or other individuals in our congregation or whatever, right? Um, so yeah, I don't know if that fully answers that question, but I mean, that's the vision of what accountability and covenant mean there.
I've got a bunch of pre-submitted questions, but while I'm looking to see where to go next, there's
Mhm.
one that I think you can answer pretty quickly from Reverend Depot. I'm sorry I mispronounced your name the first time. What will the process be for dealing with the amendments?
Mhm.
Will there be mini assemblies or any
Mhm.
opportunity, particularly to combine the two equity amendments or modify them before GA? And if not, what will happen if both equity amendments pass?
Hmm. I mean, that's a question for Charles Dumond or Meg Riley, honestly. Um, I mean, my understanding is, that we will, um, just put those up for votes, right? And we'll vote on the amendment, and then we'll vote on the overall Article 2 as amended. Would be my anticipation. I don't know if there's any chance to, combine or tweak them beforehand. Um, that's more of a moderator question, I think. Um, you know, um, I mean, since there are only four, right? I don't think it would not be onerous to vote on those individually anyway. I can keep the two equity ones separate. If they both get passed, I mean, then the first one would change that first sentence to read what the amendment does, and then the second one would add that last sentence as an additional sentence. So fortunately, they don't conflict at all. There wouldn't be any need to reconcile or anything. Um, I mean, if one of those, both of those other values passes, then obviously we would amend the circle of values to include those. Right. Um, we'll have to get a little more creative with the coloring, I guess. But but yeah, I mean that I think that's what would happen. It's just pretty, honestly, one of the more straightforward parts of this whole process, I think, at that point. But yeah, I don't know the status of like what many assemblies would do with that necessarily. Um, you know, um, because the certain elements of this are laid out in the bylaws, and the requirements this time are stricter in terms of what would pass and not. So you know um, that is a procedural question ultimately, and that's a little above my pay grade.
Rob,
Yeah.
there's a question. I'm calling you Rob,
Mhm.
Dr. Spirko.
Oh, just call me Rob.
You and I have talked so many times, preparing for
Yeah.
this, but um there's a question here, and I think Reverend Kerr and I are on the same wavelength because it was
Mhm.
literally the next question I was going to read, which is, I'll read his words. I'm especially worried that the proposed article no longer says UUA's purpose is to serve the congregations. That
Mhm.
word has been changed. He says serve is just another word for minister. Does the UUA no longer see its role in ministering us? And that's almost the same as the question that was pre-submitted. Why was the word
Yeah.
serve removed?
Mhm. Yeah. I mean, I think we need to distinguish UUAs here for a second, because that question sounds like the question is like the Unitarian Universalist Association decided to change its language and make it so it did not serve congregations anymore.
Mhm.
Right. I mean, this language came from us on the commission, right? And it went out and then it was voted on by the General Assembly of Delegates, right? I mean, if people felt super strongly about the word serve being back in there, you know, probably should have been offered as an amendment at some point. Like it's not the UUA, right, that decided something. It's the delegates that decided we'd like this, right? And several of those bullet points in the new statement of purpose, actually came from amendments at General Assembly. Right, we had a few, and
Rob,
then people added a few.
what does it now say instead of serve?
What it says now is its primary purposes are to assist, to support and train, to foster faith formation, to heal historic injustice, to support and encourage, and to advance our Unitarian Universalist values. Right, like all that had changed pretty radically. Yeah, and serve kind of went away in that, right? Um, because we focused more on what those purposes were, and gave specific verbs to those, I guess. So yeah, I don't think the intention was, and even within the UUA, you've got like the staff, the professional staff, and you've got the board, and the co-moderators, right? So like, you know, it's it's interesting to me that people tend to conflate all these different things. President Betancourt and the staff, the co-moderators and the board, and then the things that the General Assembly decides, right, are all sort of there. And the UUA as a whole kind of is an umbrella over all that. Right. So if you have questions about stuff like this, I think it's easier to answer if we are saying the staff or the board or the General Assembly sometimes. Um, you know, there's all sort of made up of people, and you know, um, can be kind of understood a little better if we make those distinctions. And honestly, coming into this work, as I was, I didn't make real strong distinctions between those when I started out, but having had the experience of the past couple of years, I'm a lot more cognizant of how these are separate kind of groups within this larger umbrella who have different jobs ultimately in a way, right? Um, so yeah, I mean, it's a good question about the elimination of serve. Um, I don't think it, you know, supposes that the UUA staff suddenly want to control the operation of congregations. That's not the intention.
Why
That's
don't you speak
not
to
even in
that
the
a little bit?
language. Yeah.
Why don't you speak to that a little bit? Democracy, congregation polity.
Mm-hmm.
People are concerned about those things leaving.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Um, yeah. And again, I kind of understand some concern about that, but I'm going to take the liberty of sharing my screen again for a second, because I did pull up the bylaws. But it says it's loading. There we go. But Article 3 is kind of what guarantees congregational independence. And so if you're concerned about these issues, I would say pay real close attention to Article 3 and if any changes are ever proposed to that part. Right. Um, but it defines it as a voluntary association of autonomous, self-governing member congregations, which have freely chosen to pursue common goals together. Right. So, I mean, that's what it guarantees. I mean, the UUA is never going to have the kind of authority I think that people worry it might have. I will say just from a practical sense, you know, um, I don't see how it would work anyway. Like, the staff is hard pressed enough to do what they do currently without trying to do any more in terms of power. Just that next section, nothing in these bylaws shall be construed as infringing upon the congregational polity or internal self-government of member congregations, including the exclusive right of each congregation to call and ordain its own ministers, control its own property, etc. Um, you know, um, and there is a way that a congregation can be removed from membership, but three things have to happen, right? They have to go for there we go. Have to go for a year and not have services, to not have one annual meeting of some kind, and to not contribute any money to the association. And if it does those things, if it doesn't do those things, then it can be declared inactive. And if it does that for 3 years, then it could be removed from membership. But that doesn't say anything about, what a congregation believes or how it does things or any of that nature, right? So, because when people started asking that, I did some digging into this just to make sure that my understanding was correct. But yeah, like I said, I don't see that the UUA is going to come into the role of some sort of enforcer or arbiter or, overseer, really.
And you use that word enforcer, and that was actually one of the questions somebody has is there enforcer? Who is the enforcer? And that kind of goes along with Reverend Kerr's last
Mhm.
You guys got so many good stuff going on here that I'm trying to find it. I just read it. He says, but if a congregation does not complete the covenant workshops, they do not get listed on the UUA website as a covenant community. So the UUA will be the judge as to who is in and out of covenant.
The
That's
covenant workshop?
Yeah, I don't know about that.
I don't know what a covenant workshop is. That's not mentioned in the. I mean, there's an annual survey or whatever, like where they ask for your officers and all that sort of stuff. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know what that would be
So that's
about.
something we need more information about. A
Yeah.
few more things that have come up in the chat that are also here. The somebody in the chat mentioned, and there was a question here that has to do with, well, the one in the chat was something like, our congregation has 250 members. Why didn't we hear about this process? Why weren't we invited to participate? I'm not seeing it right now. I'm doing it from memory, but that's similar
Yeah.
to something that was here.
Yeah.
Why wasn't I aware of these proposed changes? I feel like more should have been done to get out the word and collect feedback from more UUs.
Yeah. That's a hard question to answer in a way, because part of it is, I mean, and this is something that I ran into, right, is that I was told by UUA staff, we can't leapfrog over congregational leaders and take things directly to members. Right, they were very wary of not wanting to to overstep in that way. Right, the UUA staff was real careful not to do that. In part because of the congregational governance and the way that works. Right. Um, so, it kind of limited some of that to a degree. I mean, it's a great question, like why people didn't hear about it or whatever, you know, and I don't have my answer to it is, we need to look at our communication stuff more because, I think it highlights the problem because on our end, I mean, we sent out emails to all the ministers, all the, board presidents several times, right? I see some people shaking their heads. I mean, I'm going on what I was told. There was an email list that included, if it wasn't updated or something, I don't know, right? I'm just saying, went out. We had articles in the UU World, like I mentioned earlier. We had workshops at GA 2021. We were announced at GA 2020. And then we had 3-hour-long things with all the delegates at GA 2022. Like at that point, we were feeling like, okay, people are hearing about this. Every congregation now had gotten communications, right? Through their delegates, through their, people, through regional newsletters mentioned it. We had, thousands of responses to our surveys. you know. Um, I mean, that's, but I've heard from people, yeah, our congregation never heard it. We never got those emails. We never, and I don't know where the disconnect happens, but it really is. I mean, the way we work, stuff has to go through congregational leadership, and somehow it's not getting to them, or, people are not paying attention to it. I don't know. I can't say what's happening, you know, in those rooms, or with those people, you know.
One small thing that I might suggest, especially for people that nodded their head that they weren't notified, is that you could send me the name of your church so that I can share that back with Rob, and maybe he can
Mhm.
check in with who
Yeah.
the information went to. And if the
Mhm.
information is outdated, then we can take a first step to update
Mhm.
the outdated information if that's the
Yeah.
case.
Yeah, absolutely. Because like I said, it sort of pains me to hear that people, didn't get word on it. Um, I mean, but like I said, there was a part of me, at GA 2022, was like, okay, now we've crossed the Rubicon on this. Everybody's on notice. Um, you know, so yeah, it's just we are living in an age of information overload, which is part of the problem, I think. And that's a larger issue, I guess. But there are definitely some things we can do. We can identify where these channels aren't connecting up, for instance, and who's not hearing, and we can direct some attention to that. And I do think that that's something that, I mean, it's something that I'm going to kind of take away as a, after I'm stepped down, after this stuff is ended, right? I mean, it's, you know, an issue, because if you're going to have democratic decisions, you need to have good information, you know?
Rob, I'm going to try to move us along because there's a lot of
Yeah.
things in the chat, and there's
Mhm.
and we're getting closer and closer to 8:30. So
Yeah.
I do want to say that if you still have questions when we're done, that I can connect you to Dr. Spirko. So send me an email and I can help make that connection so you can have some direct conversation yourself. Marianne asked, can we come off mute and hear voices? It's hard for me to say yes at this point because we've got so much in the chat and here. I really want to highlight some of these things that are showing up, particularly in the chat and in the people that pre-gave their, but I want to touch on this UUA. There was a question that said something like, Rob, with your comments, does that mean that this wasn't exactly, but pretty much that UU churches can do whatever they want and the UUA won't care? And then to follow that, Mary Jo made a comment that her understanding is that the UUA represents the board, the staff, and the member congregations.
Mhm.
Should you respond to that?
Um, yeah, I mean, well, again, I don't think I can answer questions on behalf of the UUA in that sense, right? Like, but honestly, I don't know if a congregation were to say, you know, uh, we believe in, you know, destroying the earth. We think we should just bulldoze everything, right? I don't know what would happen, honestly, right? I mean, because there's not a mechanism. I mean, the UA might say publicly, hey, that's not the position of the Unitarian Universalist Association, or something like that. I mean, they might make a public statement to distance themselves. I think that would fall under the consequences of free speech, right? The congregation can say what they want, but the UA could also say, hey, this is not our shared agreement necessarily. I don't know.
Rob,
I mean, that would be speculation.
when you
Yeah.
speak of the UUA, are you specifically speaking about the board or?
That's a good question. I would imagine it would come from, like, something like that might come from President Betancourt, right? Like the UUA staff or something, but the board might, also say something, you know. Um, all that to say, to that question of, can the congregation do whatever it wants? I mean, kind of, like, I mean, the congregations are self-governing, right? I mean, the UUA can point out problems they see with it. If a congregation's going astray, I mean, that's part of um, the Cambridge platform, was that churches agreed to, both support and I mean, we don't use this word, thank God. Admonish each other, right? I get a little more hardcore. We've kind of grown away from that, I hope. But maybe other congregations would say, "Ooh, let's back up on the bulldozing everything." I mean, again, I can't think of a good example, that would work that way. But yeah, I mean, I do think that congregations are self-governing ultimately, and it's up to them on that front. In terms of what the UUA means, yeah, I mean, it means all those things, right? But in a practical sense, the UUA staff has, kind of certain jobs and roles. The UUA board has certain jobs and roles. They govern, and they're elected by the body, right? And then the General Assembly, right, really controls a lot of the direction, right, of the faith. Um, I saw briefly in the chat somebody asked about why racism, for instance, was singled out and other kinds of oppression weren't, which is another good question. Um, you know, I mean, in part, I will say because um, people have been concerned about racism and addressing it, and they've been persuasive. And we have the Eighth Principle Project, for instance, as a part of that. And in part, the delegates at General Assembly 2022 voted, right, passed a resolution telling the commission that they specifically wanted anti-racism included because it was raised as a question, right? And it was a clear, like passed like 90% to 10% or something like that, right? Like, it was the will of the General Assembly that racism be mentioned specifically. For
That
instance,
was a question that was both in the chat and in
yeah,
our notes is
yeah,
why single out racism and not name sexism,
hmm,
ableism, ageism, and other
right,
isms.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I would love for ableism to be in there explicitly or whatever, but um, maybe we can add stuff like that at some point, right? I mean, it is amendable. It takes 2 years to do it, but you don't have to wait for an entire review process to make changes going forward.
Rob, I wanted to share a comment that I really appreciate seeing in the chat from Margot Haynes.
Hmm.
And she says, "Thank you, Dr. Rob, for putting yourself out here to try and communicate better." I think that that's one thing that I've really appreciated working with Dr. Spirko too, is that he, even with his role as a commissioner in this work, he wants you guys to have as much information as you can. He wants to move things forward, and he is comfortable. He knows that everybody's not excited about it, and that people have concerns, and there's good
Hmm.
questions, and he
Right.
wants to have that feedback. It's important, and
Hmm.
also he was really just kind of willing to put himself in the hot seat tonight. So I also
Yeah. Yeah.
really appreciate that, Rob.
Right. Yeah. I want to take just a second, since you've created good feeling by thanking me for that, um, and just say, I mean, yeah, my stance throughout this has been honestly. I mean, obviously, I'm biased. I like this. I'm in favor of it. Um, I'm not going to pretend to be neutral on this front. I think it's what we need, honestly. Moving forward, I think having values, right? Because again, I saw a question at some point about like whether this was a statement of belief or something. To my mind, this is actually less of a statement of belief than what we have now with the principles, right? Because there are a lot of different ways people can hold these values and a lot of different beliefs that people could come from to arrive at these values, especially to arrive at love as the central one. Um, it feels to me a little more flexible, honestly, than what we've got currently. Um, but I really
Statement of
wanted
belief.
this year. Oh, go ahead.
Just the other words that I've heard with beyond statement of belief are doctrine and creed.
Hmm.
That they
Yeah.
feel like this is more of a doctrine or a creed.
Yeah. You know, I've been hesitant to say this, right? Um, but the fact that we've had this for 40 years and not changed it means that it's starting to act a little like a creed. I mean, I'll say that flat out. I know that's probably not popular with some people, but, honestly, it feels that way to me. Like, in other words, if you ask what a creed does, how a creed works, how a creed, is used by people, there are ways in which it's feeling a little creedal to me. right? Again, that's my personal take. I mean, that's not the position of the commission or anything like that. But that's just me speaking personally. But what I was going to say is, I really wanted this year to be where we try it out, right? People preach on it. They teach on it in RE. They see if it works in social justice. That's why I love talking to a social justice network about stuff like this. I mean, can you envision this being useful in your work to be able to say, these are our values. This is what we think about the way we should be in the world. And if you can do that, great. Like that proves that we can use it in all the ways we're using the current one and maybe better. For me, the real test was, that if it didn't do that work, right, if it couldn't work in some of these ways, then yeah, I would have to be cool with people voting it down. Like we went in, failure is always an option. We kind of said from the beginning, right? Like we had to be kind of cool with that fact that we were going to suggest some big changes. I mean, this is before we even knew what we were going to suggest, honestly, before we knew we were going to suggest big changes. But for me, it came to a head with the Tennessee 3. I don't know if y'all were following that 3 state legislators, the Democratic legislators, were threatened with expulsion from the Tennessee legislature. One woman, Gloria Johnson, who I know personally, and then 2 young black men, one from Nashville and one from Memphis, Justin Jones and Justin Pearson. And Gloria was not by 1 vote. She was retained. But Johnson and Pearson were both ejected from the legislature because they had taken the podium when the legislature was not talking about actually passing anything related to gun reform, and were ruled out of order and were targeted. And I was seeing in discussion people arguing, I made the mistake of reading comment sections, that it was fair, right? That it was a democratic vote, right? The legislature was elected democratically. They took a vote on it. It was a supermajority vote, right? Therefore, it was entirely right and proper that these men should be ejected from the legislature and that the choices of those voters in those home districts be nullified, right? So, and Susan Frederick Gray put out a statement about it, right, saying, our principles include, democratic processes. Here's the thing. I was watching people make the argument that that was a democratic process, that their expulsion was democratic. We all knew that wasn't justice, though, right? So that's how you know what kind of democratic processes we value. You can have democratic processes, but the rule of the majority can be a tyranny, right, if the rights of minorities are not respected. And so for me, I wrote a piece, right? Can I use the justice value, to articulate this? And I could. So for me, that was like the real test. If I couldn't have done that, then I was going to start having doubts myself about it, right? So that's just me, kind of, I'm hoping people will find moments like that to test it between now and General Assembly or whenever, they make their minds up. But to really think, like I'm seeing a lot of creativity, for instance, come out of RE programs. I'm pretty confident that it works there, right? I can imagine it would work really well if a congregation were to uphold those values as a congregation, right? And say we're going to be for generosity and all these sorts of things. As a congregational leader myself, going into stewardship campaign, I'm happy to have generosity in there as an articulated value, right? But it's not just, financial generosity. That, people have been kind of questioning, like, is green supposed to mean money? And I kind of wish it weren't green, honestly. Ultimately, because it is that, I'm a fan of Brian Stevenson's, Just Mercy, and he spoke at the Ware lecture a few years ago, and he talked about getting proximate, and that really, stuck with me. But like putting yourself out there, putting yourself there with people you're working with and fighting with, fighting for. We say fighting for, but really it should be fighting with. But fighting with means, a different thing. But but getting there, like being with people, right? And that's generosity with your presence, right? That is, and I think that's important to keep our good works from becoming just charity, right? And not forming those networks of mutuality that we talk about in the covenant, these relationships, which I think are the most important thing.
Rob, we've got 6 minutes left, and
Yeah.
there's a few things that we're not going to get
Mhm.
to. I did want to point out the Reverend Kerr noted where that information was about covenants and becoming in the workshops on the UA
Mhm.
website. So we'll all have to learn more about that.
Mhm.
I wanted to, as I've been thinking about Article 2, I've been thinking about the fact that I'm 52. And so I was 12 when the principles were introduced. And yes, that a lot has changed, even in my own personal life and in the world in those 40 years,
Mhm.
and will continue to change. And I love to be part of a religion, of a living tradition where we can
Mhm.
change and things don't have to be the same. But if you could speak a little bit about, you did talk about the process and how it's written in that we're supposed to review it every so many years anyway. But there's a comment here that goes along similarly to actually what was the first question I was going to ask you, that came in from our folks before this. Um, the the comment in the chat says the shame is that as of a few years ago, all of you seemed happy with the 7 or 8 principles, and now there is a major wedge being thrust between us. What
Mhm.
say you? And the question that was sent to me was there a problem within the denomination that led to revising Article 2? And those don't,
Mhm.
completely go together, but if you could
Right.
kind of touch on those in living tradition.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that's the thing is, I'm a nerd, right? I like James Luther Adams, the 20th century theologian. He talked about Revelation is not sealed, right? And, I mean, I think that for me encapsulates it. Like we are learning new things all the time, right? And, you know, I mean, there are liberal Protestant churches that are also yay science, right? And stuff like that. But I think we take it to heart a little more because we base our stuff sometimes, our sense of wonder often comes from the scientific wonder you get from knowing the complexity of the world. Anyway, um, we're sort of obligated in a way to keep updating ourselves, right? Incorporating these new insights from science and stuff into the way we understand ourselves and the world, in a way that most other religions really aren't. Um, and what I said earlier about we know how to do covenants better. Like even within our faith, we practice things and change things, and 40 years on, we understand covenants, I think, a lot better than we did in the 80s. Right? We've refined that, art, science, craft, whatever you want to call it, of covenanting, because we practiced it, we did it more, and I think I will say the thing about accountability is that's a skill you can only practice when you screw up, ultimately. And I don't want to generalize, but I think we tend to be a religion of perfectionists. We don't want to make mistakes. We don't want to screw up. We don't want to hurt people. We don't want to be insensitive to people. It pains us when we learn we might have done that. Um, and the great thing I think about a covenant is it gives you the framework to work that out, to fix that, to come back in, right? Like people, I think all too often think of covenants or use covenants as a calling out when they're really a calling in, right? And I think that's something that we have changed on, and I hope we'll continue to understand a little better. Um, so I do think that like that's an example of a change, in our governance and our just the way we organize ourselves that we're better at now than we used to be. Um, so that's the living tradition part, and you talked about the problems. In some ways, we didn't come at it from a problem-oriented point of view. We were like, what does Article 2 do? How can we do this? Like if we were to write a new one today based on who we are now, right? And not who we were in the 1980s, not who we were in the 1960s, with the consolidation, you know, like some people call us a denomination. I think we're a whole religion now, honestly. Like we are not fundamentally Christian in the way that we used to be, in the way that we were in the 1960s, even, with the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man stuff that was in the original Article 2, and so we need to kind of live into that a little bit, to be bold on that front. Um, so, um, what are problems? Well, I mean, the Eighth Principle Project points out that there were problems, You know, the fact that people noticed that the way we were reacting with relating with our sources, right, we hadn't included some important ones that were important to people now. You know, I mean, so I guess you could define those as problems, right? Um, you know, but I mean, I kind of, it's a weird question because that's not how we framed our kind of inquiry into it, you know, and not a deficit model, right? Um, you know, but I understand it does help people to understand. Yeah, there were some issues that people had been raising, you know. Um, and people have asked about sources and why we took the list of sources out, you know, and you know, I don't know if I saw one in this chat about it,
I think so.
but um, one of the things we wanted to talk about there was, not having a list that it took you 3 years to update every time you wanted to put something into it, for one thing. I personally, again, this is me personally, I think the General Assembly could pass a resolution saying these are our agreed upon sources or something like that, and it would be a little more flexible, and we could create a process for that or whatever. If people feel like they need that, we wanted to talk more about how you relate to any source, so that you could include anything. Like nobody mentioned African religions, for instance. I mean, but Paula Cole Jones and I were having a conversation about it. She's like, why does nobody mention African religions when we talk about adding sources? You know what I mean? Like, there's a lot, that list could get real long real fast. Um, the other thing that bothered, and again, this is more my kind of take on it, but we talked about it in the group. We sort of cherry pick our sources a bit in the current list, in the sense that we talk about like the Judeo-Christian, which does this, the road which do the, like we want to pick the best parts of a religion, and I'm not so sure we can do that easily, right? You can't just import, the happy parts of Christianity without importing the pain and the oppression and some of this other stuff that has come along, the denigration of women and Augustine and Paul and all this other stuff. You know what I mean? Like you know, it's not so easy to separate all. It's a complicated thing. And so, you know, it leads us sometimes to, miss things that may hurt people about some of this. And it can lead to what I'm calling like a theological tourism. We're just going to pick the nicest parts out of all these things for our nice religion and not grapple with deeper questions sometimes, and so what do we do? Well, I mean, here's how we use sources. Here's what makes something a source, and we need to respect the cultures and traditions and context that these sources come from, so that we're considering them in their fullness a little more and opening up room for grappling with some of these things. I mean, that's kind of my take on that. Um, you know, like it was really something we spent a long time wrestling with, honestly. Um, but yeah, I mean, the sources again can still be the sources, right? And we can add to them. Um, but it does help with these, larger discussion, especially the religious educators were having about cultural appropriation and proper use of other traditions and stuff like that, right? And so again, we're leaving that up to individual congregations a little more, honestly, so they can draw on the sources that are important to them, to their membership, the people who are in that room. How do they identify? What traditions do they follow? It makes it more individual. All right, I know I'm
Dr.
going over
Spirko.
time, so yeah.
Yeah, I want to be respectful of your time, but you're so passionate and into this, you probably
Yeah.
could keep going. And there's probably many people who could just keep going and we could open up the whole thing. And I want to be respectful of your time that you've given already and other people's time. So remember these things. I will send everyone, all of you who've registered, all of you have registered, and I will send you the video to this video, the video to tonight, if you want to watch it again or share it with other people. I will save the chat and send that to you as well, so you can see the questions and information that has been shared there. I just wanted to scroll down and read a few comments, particularly for you, Rob, but also for other people that might not be reading along. Reverend Deeble points out that it actually in the new wording says dismantle racism and all forms of systematic oppression. Corey Cortez, who's the director of religious education in Farmington says, thank you, Dr. Spirko, for your time and for all the information. Audrey McMullen, I'm happy. And I think this might be one of the ones that's got the most reactions in the chat so far. She says, I'm happy that we have moved from belief to action. She got a lot of hearts on that. Mark Petrie says, so important to specifically call out racism. Donna Moore says, thank you to Rob Spirko and all who made this session available. Reverend Deeble says, I have found the process to be very inclusive, lots of opportunities to offer input and ideas. And there's a good question that Susan Kinsey asked, and then Reverend Deeble answered, do ministers have the right to disagree with these with freedom of retaliation? And she pointed out that the ministers have freedom of the pulpit. Carrie Cortez says, as an RE coordinator, I am finding the kids are very receptive to the values, and I find it helps them to understand and learn how to live our values. And there are also a lot of hearts and claps for that. Sharon Peterson says, I like the wording much better than the first draft. It sounds like the persons who incorporated amendments really paid attention to what people were missing from the principles in the statement. Reverend Deeble says, not only do our bylaws require us to review Article 2, but there was discontent with the first principle and a desire for an eighth principle. I appreciate the full revisions. That one of the resources that I'll share out, a direct link that I found on the UUA website, was created by Reverend Cindy Landrum, who some of you know, she served in Flint before she moved out of state and is serving where she is now. And she did a great slideshow that compared the current principles and purposes to the new language, and how much of what was in the past is still there. So yeah, I just want to again thank all of you for coming out and participating. It's clear that, you know, one thing that we can be sure about Unitarian Universalists, or at least those of you that show up for things like that, is we are some thinking, thoughtful people, right? And I love that about us. And I love that we don't all immediately agree with everything, and that we have opportunities to be in discussion and grow and learn from each other. I think there's not enough opportunities in the world, and certainly in our backyards, where we can gather in spaces with people who we don't agree with on everything, and debate and share what we know and learn and grow from each other. And so I appreciate you all for being here. The Brighton congregation just had a service about Article 2 on Sunday that I led, and I was really pleased that after their service, they scheduled, invited anybody that wanted to stay, and they got into small groups and had conversations with each other about what they had learned from me, what they had learned before. You know, they kind of went through and looked at the language together and talked about it. And that was, I shared with that congregation that when MUUSJN first started talking about doing Article 2 work with our congregations, that's what we wanted to see. We want to see you all thinking and talking and asking questions. And so thank you for showing up tonight. Continue to send your questions, you know, to me to share with Rob, or if you want Rob's contact information. And then next steps. So next steps are, you want to continue to read and learn and talk to folks in your congregation. And then you want to make sure that you have 2 delegates from your congregation going to GA either in person or online. And then I think the most important thing, one of the things that came up in Brighton, is that your delegates should be voting, your congregation should vote, and then your delegates should go to GA and vote how your congregation votes. And that's not always how it has worked in the past, but your delegates certainly should be representing the voice of your congregation, not their own voice when they go to vote. So just a process note as you're moving forward. Oh, and I said Reverend Cindy Landrum served in Flint, but she actually served in Jackson. That's right, when Sharon was the director of religious education.
And Jenny, were you saying that Kiana Danae Perkins was up there? Because she's
Yeah.
done a great curriculum. It's one of the materials. I just want to kind of, you know, I had the pleasure of, you know, looking at it when she was working on it, because she wanted my input on it. And that's a great resource. Reverend Sherry Prudhomme has done a great theological reflection on it. And there's going to be an ebook from Skinner Press about love, about the theology of love. That's going to come out between now and GA. I don't know exactly what the schedule is, but you know that they've invited different, you know, ministers, theologians, whoever, to reflect on that question of different aspects of love. So I think that'll be a
And we're
useful
in a really
resource.
interesting place where some people are saying, why are the resources being developed when it hasn't been voted on yet and approved and moving forward? While
Right.
other people are saying, where are the resources? Why isn't there yet an elevator speech for Article 2? And so
Yeah,
I think
yeah,
it's all good food for thought. There are
mhm,
good things to be discussing, right? And creating
yeah,
resources for, depending
mhm,
on how the vote goes.
right. Well,
And
one of the things I think, a lot of these resources have been created by like religious educators or ministers. Like, in other words, the UUA has been, careful not to invest a lot of resources themselves in developing resources, so to speak, um, for that very reason. Like they are doing the collecting of and sharing of it part, right? But the actual, they are not paying people a lot, that I know of, to develop some of these resources yet, because, you know, and again, I may have had some words with them at some points about, maybe they could do a little more on this and that. But their position quite correctly was, well, this is still a proposal. We can't, look like we're giving official backing to it, all that stuff. But yeah, that's some great things out there for further exploration. And I am happy to answer other questions and things, in the chat we didn't get to.
one of the
Also,
resources,
I do weddings and bar mitzvahs. I am not a minister, but if you do online services, for instance, I mean, if I've got a Sunday free between now and the GA, let me know and I'll see if I could, I have been a worship leader, and I guess you got enough of a feel for me and just to know what you're getting into if you ask me to speak. One of the resources is a sermon I did give in Nashville earlier in the process about, you know, being prophetic in times of change. Um, I did say it helped to have a prophet beard. I will, it's really my role on the commission was to have the prophet beard, like late Ten Commandment, Charlton Heston, useful. But anyway, um, but yeah, I'm like I said, happy to answer questions when I can, or whatever.
thank you. So yeah, if you're here, expect some follow-up in the next probably 3 or 4 days after we get everything connected. I want to get you guys a nice resource list with some of the things that Dr. Spirko brought up and some of the things that I had found. I was just going to say one of the things that I found on the UUA website that was a great resource was a list of suggested songs to use if you're creating services around Article 2. And most of them were in the blue and gray hymnal, right? And so it also
Mm-hmm.
just was this reminder that everything's not drastically changing. This is
Mm-hmm.
still who we are and will continue to be. So
Right. Yeah. I just dropped a link in the chat, and I'll send that to you too, Jenny. It's a blog post by a disability activist named Mia Mingus about accountability. And it would, was very important to me in terms of my understanding of what accountability could be. And I just thought it would be good to see a positive version of that, maybe, if people have doubts and worries about it. That the kind of accountability she talks about is a great way to think about it as a learning opportunity, as a,
you know what,
yeah.
Dr. Spirko, I love that. I found that and I love it so much. And I read part of it at the Brighton Church service. And so I just grabbed that. I'm gonna read a few pieces of that as we close out. And I know we're already 12 minutes over, and so I will not be personally offended if people start clicking off as I'm reading. But if you feel compelled to stay to the end, you're welcome to do that. Thank you again, Dr. Spirko and
Oh, thank
Randy,
you.
Mary Jo and
Yeah.
Mary Ann and Sharon.
Yeah. And
What
thank you
if
all for
we
your challenging questions. I appreciate, yeah.
what if we could understand that in a violent and oppressive world, the work of love is never done? What if accountability wasn't rooted in punishment, revenge, but rooted in our values, growth, transformation, healing, freedom, and liberation? What if we learned to desire the challenging and the transformative instead of the easy and the comfortable? What if we spent more time practicing accountability, not just talking about it? So often we want other people to be accountable, but what if we practiced our own accountability more? What if we started with the small things and built up our skills for the big things? What if we remembered addressing the small things between us helps to prevent the big things? What if we talked with each other about the things we're trying to be more accountable for? What if we built relationships where we could have nuanced conversations about accountability, shame, fear, guilt, embarrassment, insecurity, trauma, and healing? What if we took more time to dream accountability, what it could be and the kind of magic it could grow, what we need in order to something? We can start with our own self-accountability and the ways that we don't show up for ourselves. We can acknowledge how most of us are in abusive relationships with ourselves. For sure, me. We blow past our own boundaries. We punish and beat ourselves up in terrible ways. We can start with the ways we treat and talk to ourselves. What if we embraced accountability as an example of what it means to be human and flawed and in relationship with one another? So I'm going to close with that tonight. I appreciate you all for being here, and I look forward to engaging with you in this work and other justice work as we move forward together. Good night.
Thank
Good
you.
night, everybody. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Rob.
Thank you. That was great.
Say good night.
Good night, Randy.